hear me in the back? Okay, so I'm asked to moderate this panel. So I thought what we do is just have each panelist go down and introduce themselves in a sentence or two, a couple things about your background, where you're coming from, and what your role is. And then once we've done that, I'll pose a few questions to you, and you guys can pose questions back to me.
Cool.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Ryan. I work for the Daily Wire, and I'm a reporter.
Okay.
My name's Eric Carvin. I'm the social media editor at AP. I've worked there for 18 years, so I've done other things there too, obviously. And I'm focused very much on sort of social strategy, and a lot of that has to do with the fact and information crisis now. So that's me.
I'm Rob Flaherty. I'm not a journalist. I'm a partisan hack. I run creative content message for Priorities USA. We're the sort of largest Democratic super PAC in the game.
Okay, so maybe I thought it might be fun to start with Eric and how he's approaching this, sitting in the middle, and then move out to the left and right and see how you're thinking about the same issue.
Well, so one thing I want to make sure is really clear at the beginning is that AP isn't in the middle. We are not centrists. We're not politically trying to be in the middle. We are nonpartisan. We're neutral. We're independent. We're just none of the above. I'm sure people think that that's not true, but it's true. Anyway, so our mission for 172 years, I think, has been based around facts from the beginning. And in fact, we've had even explicit items called AP fact checks for close to 20 years now. It's something that we have focused on very heavily, and I think it's really important for everyone to recognize that nothing suddenly came into existence in 2016 around misinformation, around facts. I think that what's happening is getting a lot more exposure, but I think it's been something that's been gradually shifting because of the way that information is exposed and so easily spread over social platforms. So I really think it has to do with a lot of developments in technology over time. There's a chicken egg thing that is probably better for Jay to study than for me to speculate about whether the people moving to the extremes in terms of their partisanship is a result of the way that we communicate today as opposed to how we did 10 or 20 years ago, or if the causation goes in the other direction, or if we even know. But the reality is that anyone can say anything to the world now, and they can build an audience. And as Jay has pointed out, if they find enough people who have the same sort of moral system as themselves, the same political philosophy as themselves, they'll find an audience that welcomes the things that they say. So. And so what do we do with that? So we at AP are trying to do a few things. First of all, we're just doubling down on who we are in the first place. We focused on facts from the beginning, we always have, and that's really important. Secondly, another thing that has always been part of our identity, but maybe is not as well understood, and that maybe we have a little more in common with advocacy groups and the folks who might be on the left and right, is that we do feel that it's part of our mission to hold people in power accountable, whoever those people might be. And that, we feel like, is a really important part of our mission, and we felt that way especially, again, during the rise of the social platforms where the misinformation can easily spread. And this is the difference, I think, for AP, is that we don't care who that is. I mean, obviously people who are more powerful are more important to scrutinize, but we do still believe in a notion of objectivity and balance that I think has not been in vogue in recent years. But it's just that I think balance is misunderstood. The way we look at it, balance means that we scrutinize everybody the same way. That we think, that we try to dig and make sure we understand what everyone's doing and saying, and that we report the truth about it. It doesn't mean that ultimately we say, he said that and she said that, even though one of them's true and one of them's false, and we go about our business. But it means that we do our work in a way that starts from a point of neutrality and frankly skepticism. Just always being skeptical about what people in power say. Now, the challenge that we're running into now, obviously, is that whatever we report, people believe what they believe. I mean, that's a really simple way to put it. And so we are trying our best to be part of the solution. So an example, so we have a whole fact-checking team. Again, this is something that's not new. It's something, it gets a lot more attention now. But we are working directly with Facebook, for example, as some other organizations are, to assess, I guess you could say, content on Facebook that people have identified as questionable or even that they haven't, things that are about topics that are really hot in the news or just things that are trending heavily. And we can step in and say something's false or say it's true. And if we do that, it can affect whether you see it on Facebook. And now, this is something that is, I mean, depending on how you feel and how your politics are or how you feel about the news industry, I don't know if that makes people nervous, but we feel like we are in as good a position to do this as anybody. Facebook doesn't want to do it by itself. It's certainly part of their own identity and very important to them that the world doesn't see them as a news provider. That's a very complicated issue unto itself because in some ways they definitely are. So but we are, and we're able to step in and in some ways essentially provide that service, and we hope that it helps. How we execute that is really, really critical. I mean, it's something that that Jay's research kind of touched on is that, and that, if you look at the way Facebook executed this early on, if you tell people who find a false news story, sorry, this is false, and AP's found that it's false, here's the true story, they will believe it even more, of course, right? They will dig in, they become suspicious of the messenger instead of believing the message, even though it's, and it doesn't help that people don't really have as much loyalty to news brands as they used to. So we're still figuring out how to best execute on this. One thing we've learned is that people are more open to the notion of being exposed to different perspectives on an issue than they are to being told that the one that they read is wrong. And so we feel like there might be something to go into there. I could talk about this for hours. I think I have before too. But that's kind of where we're sitting right now as a news organization. And we don't feel like we can solve this problem by ourselves, but we feel like a lot of it is just continuing to be who we've always been. But we're also trying to work with the platforms where some of this problem is taking place and try to clean things up.
So I'm just going to add two comments, and I'll turn to Ryan. So one thing that I think you're alluding to is that polarization is not new. The use of fake news is not new. Political propaganda is not new. And so my view on this, and the brains that we walk around with are very old. They were carved in evolution hundreds of thousands of years ago. And so we have this groupish capacity, this tribal nature that's part of human nature. And then what it does is it gets teed up in political context, and then social media are almost like a vehicle for amplifying it. So they just amplify our natural tendencies, I think, in ways that can kind of get out of control. The other thing I think that's important here for people, if you aren't interested in politics, Paul made a really good point during his opening address, whereas you get caught up in it really quick. If the case with Skittles, I think you used, becoming a metaphor for immigration, Syrian refugees. Another issue, product that got caught up in this was Keurigs. It wasn't that long ago that people were taking videos smashing Keurigs. And so, very quickly, in a matter of a few moments, one offhand comment by somebody in a highly politicized content, things get attached to that. All kinds of products, Starbucks does several times, if a viral video gets out. And so all of these processes get overlaid on some kind of third party that wants no interest in this and suddenly has to make a call or pick a side or have a public statement. And so that's also, I have to say, for me psychologically so fascinating how quickly it's almost like a wildfire and it catches on something else and the wind is blowing in the right way and all of a sudden there's a massive fire next door. So that's, I think, another issue why people should care about this. So I'll turn it to Ryan now and get his thoughts.
Cool. So our organization's goal is to focus on just telling the truth and covering narratives that the media, a lot of the mainstream media are not going to cover. And, we are honest about who we are. So we are, a very conservative news organization. And I think that really helps with our trust and credibility with viewers. So If you've never been to the Daily Wire, people go there to read commentary from Ben Shapiro, and yeah.
Okay, I'll just add something that's later on before I turn to Rob, so just cue you up. When you also look at the readership, I don't know if this affects your readership, but if you look at, for example, the following of US senators, the people who have by far the largest followings are as you get out to the extremes. And so, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders have much bigger followings than people who are moderate. And then on the right, people like Jeff Sessions and Ted Cruz has a huge following. And so that one thing is that, and we're doing research on this now, is that the human incentive system, what we find rewarding and what gets rewarded are often things that appeal to people who make extreme, a stronger case for whatever their value system are. And so I wondered if, I thought I'd turn to Rob and get his thought on this, but then maybe come back and think are you guys feeling that incentive structure, and is that driving your editorial decisions?
Yeah, I mean, I am less beholden to editorial decisions because, I run ads and create content from a sort of lefty perspective, sort of the goal for persuasion. I think one of the things that I think about a lot as we're sort of thinking about political content, and political messaging, and sort of the space that, is in that big map that was up here is it used to be that there's a lot of push messaging in sort of politics generally, and also we're pretty bad at content as an industry. For example, it would sort of be like if you map out how you talk to people and talk to voters, you sort of have your supporters and you ask them for money and you ask them to volunteer and you might hit some content to them, but they're not a persuasion audience who really matters. You're trying to convince your sort of low propensity voters to come out. You have your persuasion universe who you're hitting with your sort of broadcast messaging, and then you hope that your opponent's supporters don't hear there's an election, right? Which is just not really feasible. I think that in the space that we're in right now, where there are these sort of big partisan gulfs, and you're an organization like Priorities or any political campaign, you have to be thinking about what is sort of messaging and content that will sort of inflame, work through those sort of partisan echo chambers, but also in being shared, be persuasive to people in the middle, right? And so that's sort of the sweet spot, right? It's sort of finding these messages that are really persuasive, that also drive engagement, right? With the people that are already with you, because politics, we're really lucky that we have brand loyalists, right, who view talking to our sort of, or engaging with our sort of viewpoint as core to their being, right, and core to who they are. And so that is a real advantage, and we just sort of have to start figuring out tactically how we get there. I think a lot about sort of the poll-based messaging universe. Right now, Democrats were on defense in a lot of red states, right? These Trump-heavy states, and the thing that comes back a lot in polling is this idea that people want bipartisan problem solvers, right? People who will just solve problems bipartisanly. And that's an interesting message to put in an ad when you're pushing it at people, but when you're trying to get into an environment that has sort of this partisan crosshairs, you have to be thinking about what are the messages that will actually be persuasive to that group that you can then route through your supporters. So I think that is just sort of a fundamental reality of the space, and a thing that this is sort of upheaved, I guess that's not a word, has changed as sort of political messengers and political content creators start thinking about how we create and distribute content.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yeah.
So as you're trying to get things to catch on in political echo chambers, this is something I'm interested in too. So is there not a temptation to play with the truth a little bit? I mean, isn't it more? If goal one is to get people to get fired up about certain issues, isn't it? I mean, this is a really easy, facile way to put it, but isn't it easier to do that with things that are a little bit skewed as opposed to doing it with pure facts?
It's not facts, it's emotion. I mean, here's the thing. I want to make that point super clear. I think that this is a fire with fire problem. I can say pretty much it is a standard on the left to have a really robust research shop when you're producing content, that everything we put out goes through a very rigorous sort of fact check. There's very peculiar language that you'll see in political ads, and it's usually that we're trying to get around, be maximally sort of effective while trying to get words through. Pretty much every piece of content that I put out has to go through 2 researchers and a lawyer. That is a problem because we're up against sort of Sean Spicer crowd size and MS-13 and sort of all these things. And so, yeah, I mean, there is always that balance. I think, in the sort of progressive, at least institutional progressive campaign space, there is sort of an adherence to keeping things factual, but I think it's just a question of how you phrase things to have them be both accurate and sort of emotionally evocative.
So, to be fair, and this is not about your organization in particular, but I mean, I feel like from both sides of the political spectrum, you've got well-meaning, fact-based, or at least sort of organizations that are relying on facts that are dealing with the fact that there are people on the other side who aren't relying on facts. Right? This happens left to right and it happens right to left. Right? So it seems like is this kind of a universal sort of struggle to be able to be advocating for. I don't mean to be the moderator here. I won't ask more questions. But could you throw another log on the fire? To be able to make an argument that this is fact based and we believe the truth is with our viewpoint, while fighting what you see as being a lot of bending on the other side. And I'm curious from both of you about that, and then I'll stop asking questions.
I am not super sure how to answer the question. I think that I think that I think there's a lot of people in the sort of progressive space who are like, oh, these folks on the right with their fake news and da-da-da-da-da. And I think there is like a sort of lefty fake news issue as well. And, we got to fight dirty. Like you hear that one a lot. I don't know. I think that there are ethical lines that I'm not willing to cross. And I think that most the sort of political campaign infrastructure of the left is not willing to cross, but I'm sure there are people out there who are doing that.
I'll invite Ryan to weigh in, or if you have a question too for anybody on the panel.
Yeah, I actually was just going to expand a little bit on what he said about creating content that really is truthful and accurate, but really invokes emotion. That's, especially if you're not completely neutral and completely centrist, that's really key to having your content spread. One of the things that we do, I think to be really successful at that is, for example, photo selection. A lot of news organizations will run the same photos. We might spend more time in Getty or in AP, finding stuff and, really coming up with images that people haven't seen before, writing headlines in certain ways. You can have 2 different headlines that are, each 15 words long and contain, for the most part, all the same words, but the way that you arrange the words can be, that can have a huge impact. And really looking, so for example, for me, before I came into media, I was in sales. And so I look at media a little bit differently. I look at it through a sales lens. But I think that finding a way, again, to come up with content that, appeals to a certain base of readers, but at the same time is accurate and truthful, is, important.
And I'll expand on that with 2 sort of very specific examples. Very recently we were running sort of a content campaign against a candidate who's an attorney general, and essentially he took a donation from a person and then the next day started an investigation into that person's sort of corporate enemy. And we started trying to put out content that called him a slime ball, right? Which it's name calling, but it's emotionally evocative, whatever. It got walked back to ethically challenged. And then I was doing some work for an organization, an LGBT organization, and we were sort of rebutting Ben Carson, who was saying he'll protect sort of the LGBT community and stand up for them and protect them from discrimination. And I think it said something to the effect of Ben Carson says he'll protect the LGBTQ community from discrimination. Yeah, right. And the sort of research and legal team changed it to Ben Carson says he'll protect the LGBT community from discrimination. What was it? Past evidence leads us to believe this is not true. Right? And so that is the constant
lawyers
give and take. Yeah, totally. Lawyers. Sorry if there are lawyers in the room, but you make my life hell. And so, yeah, I mean, it's that space that we have to
we actually, I mean, we deal with a similar challenge that we have to address in a different way. I mean, we are obviously trying to, we want people to see our stuff, and it's not because we're trying to persuade people one way or another. We're trying to report the news. We're trying to expose truth. We're just focused on being, a news organization, and we've found that obviously emotional content, as is well established, does very, very well out in the digital world. And so what do we do? And so does strongly opinionated content. So, well, we can't really do either of those things. We can't really, we can't do opinion. We don't do any opinion at AP because we have customers that range from, Breitbart to MSNBC. So what do we do? So we found other ways into it, and I'm sure a lot of people in this room have probably thought the same way too. Finding the emotional arc in a story, focusing on people, and the way that I mean, something big could happen in the news. We might come at it 4 or 5 different ways because it's a big story, so we're doing multiple pieces on it. We're doing videos. We're doing lots of things. But we find in most cases the smaller stories we do that zoom in on the impact on a person or a series of people is what does very well on social platforms in particular, and just in the digital world too. It's not all that we do, but it's a really important element of what we do. And you kind of can't blame people. I mean, it's good to make sure you have all the data you need to really tell the story and be really firm about your conclusions. But ultimately, people want to know. Well, first of all, does this affect me and how, ideally? And if not, how does this affect other people? And how could I, can I put myself in that person's shoes? That's what causes people, I think, to get into a piece of content, and more importantly, to stay with it longer, to go deeper into it. And so that's kind of how we handle that. Opinion we can't do, we don't want to do, obviously. But at the same time, like I said, holding people in power accountable can have a similar impact in some ways. It gets misinterpreted as opinion. When we say Donald Trump did something bad, Hillary Clinton did something bad, people feel that as us being biased about that person. And our argument is like, no, we looked at the facts and we came to the conclusion that they didn't tell the truth about this, or whatever it might be. But it's really interesting, and I'm sure that Jay knows a lot more about this from a brain perspective, but it's really interesting how people perceive things as bias or perceive things as slant, when in reality, what it is just bad news about your guy, and that's a big challenge that we have in the news industry. We want to still do that stuff, but there's a risk that when we report, when we broke the big story about Hillary Clinton's email server, that we're just going to be preaching to people on the right, and when we break a story about Donald Trump doing something, we're just preaching to the left, and being able to cross those lines and make our news relevant to everybody, and in particular relevant to the people who would not have known about this thing already, is still a huge challenge for us.
Yeah, I wanted to move to questions from the audience. So
Jay, my question's for you. Is for those of us who are marketers in the room. Is this on? I think it's on. Those of us who are marketers who are in the room, that polarization that you talked about is not just in politics; it's in everything, right? It's in fracking and anti-fracking. It's in Samsung and Apple. It's in Red Sox and Yankees. So, from a marketing and from public relations perspective, how do you break that? How do you do that? I mean, everything's polarized now, almost. So how do you begin to? Is there a solution, or should you just only focus on your core, and how you deepen with that core? I mean, and from a political perspective, I know that you would look at it, but from an election, you would look at it from a county perspective, and you would say, how do people in County A talk to people in County B, so that we can move the state? I'm just wondering, because that first chart you put up with the years in the very beginning, that's not going to get better.
So the question
you're a behavioral
is,
scientist, and I'm a hack.
Okay, so the question is, how do you market to people? Polarization and bifurcation are happening with Red Sox and Yankees, left and right, all these types of identities. And so the question is, how do you connect to them? And so I would say there's 2 answers. One is you tailor 2 messages to one to Yankees fans, one to Red Sox fans, and you run it in different markets. Or the other thing, and this tends to work a lot in psychology, is you find a higher identity. And you actually see that sometimes during Super Bowl ads, where you'll see people appealing to kind of some broader American identity. I always feel like, so like a classic example of this, so we think of Democrats and Republicans being very polarized, and it's very hard for any president to get over 50% approval in this country. Well, if you look what happened after 9/11, George Bush's approval went from 50% to 90% within a week. Because the moment there's an external threat, it bumps your level of identity up from Democrat, Republican to American.
So babies and animals for everything.
Yeah, babies and animals for everything. That's why cat videos are, I think, the answer to all of this.
Babies with animals.
Yeah.
See?
We'll take a question from the gentleman behind you.
Here you go. So, sort of piggybacking off of that, you're trying to go to like a broader identity, but one problem you mentioned, Eric, was that like when you try to just do something that's more like neutral or like not one side or the other, people will still find fault with it and say like, no, it's an opinion. Have there been any changes, and again, going back to what both of you said, like in language or like changes in like text or anything that you've seen like tactically that can sort of like dissuade them from creating an opinion piece on one side and goes back to that idea of like it is a larger American identity problem, or we're just looking from this from a very objective scope?
Yeah, I mean, our perspective on that, it's a good question. Our perspective on that is, first of all, we're still going to do what we do. And we try not to get too caught up in people mischaracterizing it in the ways that fit their own viewpoint, you know? So we don't want to get too caught up in that. We're reporting the truth, we're reporting the facts, and we're very confident that we know how to do that. The other thing is, I think it actually makes it more effective if you are being if you're more concretely holding people accountable and being really, and this includes fact-checking what public figures are saying. This is a good example of this. Now, every time you fact-check what a public figure says, you're going to have some people who are going to cheer you on, and other people are going to say boo, and again, they're going to have that same slant reaction. But if you do that really consistently, and if you do it really quickly, I tell people that if a public figure says something questionable and we realize it's not true, we should make that clear before you get to the period in that sentence. You know, that's not something we necessarily would have always done in the past, but we've learned how important it is, partly because people don't read enough of the story. Read more of the story, everybody. So my feeling is consistency and making sure that you approach it from different directions. It's very different from how a marketer would need to approach this, because we're not concerned if our fact-based reporting makes some people angry. I mean, or makes some people not like us as much. If we feel like we've done our jobs right, then we can live with that. And also, there are some people who they probably hated us already, frankly. I mean, there's nothing there. Even with the fact checking that we're doing, we're really hoping to reach the people who are sort of, susceptible to it, but really do want the truth. There are people on the fringe who have their opinions and who are not going to sway from them. We're not going to change their mind, and that's not really our job to change their mind. We want other people to be persuaded by facts and just keep going at it relentlessly, and that's our approach. But again, yeah, if you're a marketer, you probably need to do something different.
I think about this particular issue from a political lens a lot about what you do about this. My former employer was a $1 billion failed startup in Brooklyn called Hillary for America, and we ran into some problems with this. I think there's like an interesting sort of problem here, which is that like there's a mainstream position in the Democratic Party about digital and about content, which is that the Russians and bots and this right-wing ecosystem are why we lost. And also that digital and content and advertising online and organizing online is untested and unproven and is not a worthwhile expenditure for campaigns and political organizations, right? Outside of the presidential, there was some research that went around that said the average Democratic campaign spent about 4% of its budget on digital. And the NRSC won't even give money to a Republican campaign unless they spend 25%, right? And that's like media expenditure, like that's not exactly pound for pound. But like, if you think about like what the Russians did and what the right did and how they do it, they build communities, right? They create content for those communities. They maybe artificially, enhance how far it's going with like bots and amplifiers and all these things. But that's just like digital strategy, right? And so like there's a level to which there's like nefarious stuff going on and like ooga booga and whatever. But like for a Democrat and for a progressive who's like seeing this happen, half the solution is just like being there, right, and engaging.
Just let Ryan, did you have anything to add, or do you want me to go to the next question?
You can go to the next
Okay,
question.
thanks. So, yeah, if you speak up, I can just repeat it for the group.
Do you think the public is more skeptical and cautious right now about being manipulated by messages with Cambridge Analytica or Russian hackers? Being more aware of things that we or other people know have been going on for a while?
Okay, so the question is, do you think the public is now more skeptical as an audience? So I'll just pass it maybe to Ryan and go down the panel.
Yeah, I mean, there was a recent study that came out that showed, it was maybe a couple of weeks ago, that showed, I think 77% of Americans, believe that the mainstream media puts out fake news. And obviously you're going to have more distrust on the political right. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the majority of the mainstream media tends to be a little center-left. Yeah, I mean, in terms of, if people are more skeptical now, I would say yes. And, more indicators that you could put to, if you look at the recent congressional hearings, around Facebook, and you look at, what a lot of people perceive, as censorship from, companies like Google, companies like Facebook, Twitter, I think that you're, seeing more of that kind of.
It's interesting. There's a study that's just been coming out recently too. I think it's a different one. This is from the Reuters Institute and Oxford. They actually just did the New York announcement this morning. I came here from there, and one thing that they found, they were surveying people. This is global, which makes it a little different, but still very interesting. They were asking people what they think fake news is. Now, fake news is a very loaded term. Obviously, we don't really use it in our copy because it's like people interpret it in different ways, and it's much more accurate, and I think a little easier and more consistent to talk about things like misinformation or falsehoods. But anyway, when people hear fake news, the top and this is a majority. A majority of people said that fake news is news organizations either making mistakes or acting in a hyper-partisan way. The number one thing was not made up stuff, just like completely made up out of whole cloth, random stories of things that didn't actually happen. It was news organizations making mistakes and being too partisan. So the couple pieces here. First of all, you got to take this a little bit with a grain of salt, because they may view things as mistakes that are not mistakes. And they may see them as mistakes because they contradict their worldview. So, there's some risk of that. But the bottom line, and this is something that we need to take to heart as an industry, and what I do is that the other thing is that they expect us to solve this problem. And I guess that's kind of fair in a way. We also earlier this week, AP together with NORC, which is a pollster based at the University of Chicago, put out a new poll, and one of the conclusions of that poll was that wait, I'm going to make sure I get this right. That people, I'm sorry, I'm totally blanking on my point. What my point was here, but it was sort of related to this. Anyway, I'll go back. Oh, here's what it was. It's good. Another log on the fire, if you would, Jay. Okay. It was that when you ask people what do they want from news, they actually say they want more facts and less opinion. And that is interesting because that, at least as far as I perceive it, is new. And secondly, they might be fooling themselves. They may not actually want that. They may just be saying they want that. But it's possible that because of what's been going on in recent years, and because of the Russian bots, et cetera, that people are trying to come home to facts and are maybe coming home to the notion of objectively reporting the news. I kind of hope so. Now, a majority of people, still there's a whole lot of people who feel otherwise, but I think it's interesting that we might be at a little bit of a turning point.
Yeah, before we go to the next question, I want to ask you, is APs are people checking, because you guys are known as, pretty fact-based, non-opinion reporting. Are people actually doing that in your data? Are you seeing data showing that they're turning way more to AP than they used to?
So it's always hard for us to know that, because we're a wholesaler, so most of our distribution of content happens through third parties, but to the extent that we do directly connect with consumers, we've definitely seen good growth recently. I don't know that we've ever been able to draw a line between one thing and the other. But one thing I would say is that in recent years, any kind of story that we identify as a fact check does exceedingly well, incredibly well. Now, it's possible it's doing well entirely among people who already believe the thing that we say in there, but this was an example during the 2016 campaign, so this is before Trump was elected, whenever there was a debate that we were covering, everybody just wanted to see the fact check of the debate. They weren't interested in our regular story. They were, but not as much. They weren't as interested as in our blow-by-blow updates. The thing they liked more than anything else is go through the things that each person said and then tell the truth about that thing. And maybe they always would have if we had been doing that in higher volume earlier. But the reality is that I think there's actually a craving for facts now. Now, of course, people want the facts that confirm what they believe, and it doesn't necessarily solve the problem, but at least they're outwardly looking for them.
Okay, I'm going to turn to another question.
This is a whole other topic or day of discussion, but you kind of brought it up with citing the polls. Polling dead, or is current behavior really where it's at?
So the question is polling dead?
Oh, we'll solve that one too. Yeah.
Maybe we'll turn to Rob and Ryan if they thought.
It's not dead. I think there's just other data inputs. I think polling is accurate, but you have to sort of understand what you're using it for. It's a great measure of messaging that's popular. It is still a good measure of horse race and like where people are. It may not necessarily be, at least in my perspective, the measure of the thing that is most persuasive from a message standpoint because the format's weird. For me, I think that we take a look because we're a polling intensive and a research intensive organization. We always try and match information that we get from sort of offline research, polls and focus groups and all that stuff with sort of actual creative testing and content testing, which but at the same time, it's like I think the sort of political space particularly has been so poll driven and driven by the 2-point differential in a message battery that we're not thinking about like, okay, how do you actually execute that in a good way and what effects are we seeing because of the content and generally, I mean, obviously there was a huge polling error in 2016, but I think, there have been sort of subsequent adjustments in research methods and pollsters are always sort of moving. So it's down, but not out.
I'm gonna take a little bit of issue. I don't think there actually was that huge a polling error in 2016 because I think what happened to a large extent is people misinterpreted the polls very badly. And in fact, there were a lot of polls that said Hillary Clinton would win by 2 or 3 points, and that's what happened in the popular vote. It was close enough to that it was within the normal margin. But the reality is that that's not how you win elections, and so it was really, there was a lot of really bad execution, which is really kind of to the point that you're making. But we're actually, and you can do your own research about this if you want, but we're actually, AP is coming out with an alternative to the exit poll this year, which is going to be a whole new approach that's going to hopefully do a better job of capturing people who are voting in alternative ways, like mail-in ballots and early voting and all of that, and hopefully also counteract some of the bias against pollsters that can make polls bad. So look that up if you think that's interesting.
I'll just add to that. There are, from a science perspective, to follow up at that point, they did find that exit polls are misrepresenting certain groups, and that people misunderstand probability estimates. So all polls are given with a probability rather than, it's not like a fact, but people interpret it as factual reporting, and it's not. They just don't understand it. Another issue with polls, a serious issue, is that people don't answer their phones anymore. And so the main tool for getting representative samples that polls are based on is socially outdated. So that's part of the problem. That's kind of an existential problem.
It's a big problem. I used to be an exit poll analyst. I won't go too much, but it used to be, before that became an issue, the only kinds of polls that people found reliable were either in person or on a landline phone. And so when suddenly nobody's on phones anymore, it means you have to rethink it, but it doesn't mean that science can't catch up.
I'll take one more question right here.
Ryan and Rob particular, because you're on opposite ends of the political spectrum as far as your publications are concerned. I know that the people who are coming to your pages, the consumers, I think that it's pretty clear who they're going to go to. But what about the relationship with companies and brands? Because I remember the Samantha Bee issue, the bar issue. Whenever there's a problem where somebody is maybe saying something that's maybe ethically wrong or interpreted that way, too far to the right or left, we're seeing that a lot more companies are responding to that, and they haven't in the past. And I wanted to get a sense from you too, if you've seen any sort of pushback from brands, from representative brands, to your publications, whether that's through advertising, whether that's even just participating in partnering in any aspect whatsoever. Just want to see if there's any effect there.
You want to go first? Yeah, so I mean, we really haven't seen, we haven't seen any pushback or anything. So, I think as long as you focus on, telling the truth and, being honest about who you are and what your views are, and not trying to parade yourself around as being, unbiased when in reality you're very biased, you'll be fine. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've run into just less of that. I think that we run into, I think there's a problem with platforms, right? They're so conscious of sort of the right-wing concern that, Google is anti-conservative, that they're actually more likely to rough up a Democrat who screws up by taking down their content or things like that. That's top of mind because I have experienced that. I think that. There's definitely, when you are a partisan organization that is approaching a brand to work together, we don't really work with corporate brands so much. We'll do sponsored content, and usually an organization that is trying to maintain some level of objectivity is less likely to work with a political organization. We also deal with this a lot in the influencer space. It is friggin' hard to get a YouTuber to sort of push a political message that is specifically partisan or specifically candidate tied, because it sort of hurts their brand and they are sort of taking a risk. And so, it can be really, really hard to work with that particular group of creators if you're a political organization who's trying to push a persuasion message.
Okay, I think we're probably out of time, so thanks for joining us in the conversation.
Thanks, Jay.